For myself, the delay may be compared to a reprieve. For in confidence, I assure you, with the world it would obtain little credit, that my movements to the chair of government will be accompanied by feelings not unlike those of a culprit who is going to the place of his execution. So unwilling am I, in the evening of a life nearly consumed in public cares, to quit a peaceful abode for an ocean of difficulties, without that competency of political skill, abilities, and inclination which is necessary to manage the helm.
If the first President of the United States of America expressed some trepidation at proceeding to his post, the hesitation can be well understood. George Washington was not stepping into anyone's place. The business of being president was not at all the refined operation that it is today. As our first presidents worked to shape their office and the governing body of the United States, the later presidents adopted new practices and embraced new technologies as the day-to-day operation of the office continued to evolve. With each new challenge that subsequent administrations faced, new accoutrements arose to aid the president in conducting his life and work. Join us as we look at the agencies, buildings, vehicles, and tools of the trade of the president, from politics to power.
I take the liberty of requesting a favor of you to engage lodgings for me previous to my arrival. Mr. Lear, who has lived with me 3 years as a private secretary, will accompany or precede me in the stage, and Colonel Humphreys, I presume, will be of my party. On the subject of lodgings, I will frankly declare to you that I mean to go into none but hired ones, if these cannot be had tolerably convenient, for I shall not be nice about them. I would take rooms in the most decent tavern till a house can be provided for the more permanent reception of the President. I have already declined a very polite and pressing invitation from the Governor of New York to lodge at his house till a place could be prepared for me, after which, should any other offer of a similar nature be made, there could be no propriety in my acceptance of it.
It is said that George Washington's first presidential residence impressed simple people with its elegance and impressed elegant people with its simplicity. The brick, 3-story house on the corner of Cherry and Franklin Streets in New York City, which served as the United States Capitol from 1789 to 1790, was alternately known as the Franklin House and the Samuel Osgood House, after the first and second husbands of Maria Brown Osgood, who had offered the house to Congress for use by the president-elect. The house had rented formerly to presidents of Congress, and while in use by President Washington, the home contained the private office of the president, the public business office, and Washington's living quarters. A niece of Walter Franklin, Quakeress Sarah Robinson, described the preparation of the house a day before Washington's arrival in a letter from April of 1789.
Great rejoicing in New York on the arrival of General Washington. Previous to his coming, Uncle Walter's house in Cherry Street was taken for him, and every room furnished in the most elegant manner. Aunt Osgood and Lady Duer had the whole management of it. I went the morning before the general's arrival to look at it. The best of furniture in every room, and the greatest quantity of plate and china I ever saw. The whole of the first and second stories is papered, and the floors covered with the richest kind of Turkey and Wilton carpets. The house did honor to my aunts and Lady Kitty. They spared no pains nor expense on it. Thou must know that Uncle Osgood and Dewar were appointed to procure a house and furnish it. Accordingly, they pitched on their wives as being likely to do it better. I have not yet done, my dear. Is thee not almost tired? There is scarcely anything talked about now but General Washington and the palace.
Washington conducted his business as president in the Osgood House until February of 1790, during which time he met with domestic and foreign dignitaries, and he and his wife held state dinners every Thursday. It was in the Osgood House that Washington wrote the first Thanksgiving proclamation, setting aside the last Thursday in November as the national holiday. While the Osgood House has the distinction of being the first seat of the federal government, it soon proved too small to conduct the meetings, gatherings, and accords that President Washington needed to accommodate. In addition, the house was located in one of the most congested parts of Manhattan due to its proximity to the port along the East River. On February 23, 1790, Washington relocated to the Alexander Macomb House on Broadway in Manhattan. Recently vacated by the French minister, Washington purchased the furnishings of the house for his use, and some of the pieces still survive at Mount Vernon today. Washington even had his own stables built at the second presidential mansion, but 5 months later, in July, the Residence Act of 1790 relocated the Capitol and presidential residence to Philadelphia for 10 years, while the permanent Capitol and White House were to be constructed in Washington, D.C. The act was passed just as New York State was completing what would have become Washington's third New York residence. The Government House later served as the State Governor's House, a boarding house, a customs house, and the home of the New York Historical Society. In Philadelphia, Washington occupied the presidential mansion, previously owned by Robert Morris, a senator and personal friend of Washington's. Indeed, Washington lodged at the house while Morris owned it during the 1787 Constitutional Convention. Here, Washington served the rest of his terms as president, save for 2 brief stays at Germantown when a plague of yellow fever swept through Philadelphia. Until 1797, when Washington gave a dinner to President-elect John Adams. The first president of the United States toasted the second, saying,
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the last time I shall drink your health as a public man. I do it with all sincerity, wishing you all possible happiness.
Adams served in the presidential mansion in Philadelphia until 1800, when he moved in to oversee completion of the White House. Though the outer walls were not quite finished, the Adams braved the cold winter months as the first family to stay in the White House.
I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof.
President John Adams wrote that statement to his wife on his second day in the newly built White House on November 2nd, 1800. In 1939, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had the words inscribed on the stone fireplace of the state dining room. They remain there to this day. Designed by Irish architect James Hoban, the White House was built in the neoclassical style of white-painted Aquia Creek sandstone. While Adams was the first president to live in the White House, his stay was a short one. In 1801, Thomas Jefferson moved in and became the first president to stay in the House for his full terms in office. Jefferson called the White House a pleasant country residence, and even though Jefferson thought the house too big, he still sought ways to add upon the structure. The east and west colonnades, originally designed by Jefferson and architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe, were built to conceal domestic operations such as a laundry, stables, and storage, and today still stand as connections to the east and west wings of the White House. Only 13 years later, the White House went from under construction to under siege. As the United States was once again locked in battle with Great Britain during the War of 1812, the new American capital came under fire in 1814 in what became known as the Burning of Washington. The British, in retaliation for the burning of Upper Canada's Parliament buildings in the Battle of York, attacked Washington, D.C., and set the White House on fire. Paul Jennings, a slave owned by then-President James Madison, was just 15 when he witnessed the evacuation and attack on Washington, as he recounted in his later life.
After the war had been going on for a couple of years, the people of Washington began to be alarmed for the safety of the city, as the British held Chesapeake Bay with a powerful fleet and army. Everything seemed to be left to General Armstrong, then Secretary of War, who ridiculed the idea that there was any danger. But in August 1814, the enemy got so near that there could be no doubt of their intentions. Great alarm existed, and some feeble preparations for defense were made. Commodore Barney's flotilla was stripped of men, who were placed in battery at Bladensburg, where they fought splendidly. A large part of his men were tall, strapping Negroes, mixed with white sailors and Marines. Mr. Madison reviewed them just before the fight and asked Commodore Barney if his Negroes would not run on the approach of the British. "No, sir," said Barney. "They don't know how to run. They will die by their guns first." They fought till a large part of them were killed or wounded, and Barney himself wounded and taken prisoner. One or two of these Negroes are still living here. It has often been stated in print that when Mrs. Madison escaped from the White House, she cut out the frame of the large portrait of Washington, now in one of the parlors there, and carried it off. This is totally false. She had no time for doing it. It would have required a ladder to get it down. All she carried off was the silver in her reticule, as the British were thought to be but a few squares off, and were expected every moment. John Soucet, a Frenchman, then doorkeeper, and still living, and McGraw, the president's gardener, took it down and sent it off on a wagon with some large silver urns and such other valuables as could be hastily got hold of. When the British did arrive, they ate up the very dinner and drank the wines, etc., that I had prepared for the president's party.
From 1815 to 1817, the White House was rebuilt. During the American Civil War, the position and overcrowding of the White House led some in Congress to propose a separate residence for the president and use the White House only for business. A new estate was designed at Meridian Hill in Washington, D.C., but the plan was ultimately rejected. When Theodore Roosevelt moved into the White House in 1901, further expansions and renovations took place, such as the establishment of the West Wing for official day-to-day functions of the office of president, and later, President William Howard Taft expanded upon the West Wing with the addition of the Oval Office. Greeting the 27th President of the United States were silk velvet curtains and a checkerboard floor made of mahawa wood from the Philippines. Caribou hide tacked with brass studs covered the chairs in the room. President Taft chose the olive green color scheme. President Roosevelt's office had been rectangular. Taft relocated the office and changed its shape to oval, like the Blue Room in the White House. Preferences for oval rooms date to the time of George Washington. At the president's home in Philadelphia, Washington had 2 rooms modified, with a bowed end in each that were used for hosting formal receptions called levees. As his guests formed a circle around him, Washington would stand in the center to greet them. For President Taft, the Oval Office may have symbolized his view of the modern-day president. Taft intended to be the center of his administration, and by creating the Oval Office in the center of the West Wing, he was more involved with the day-to-day operation of his presidency than were his recent predecessors. The office was further redesigned and expanded by Presidents Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt, the former adding more space to the office, and the latter going so far as to enlist New York architect Eric Gulger to excavate a full basement and adding a basement layer of offices, as well as a penthouse story. Until 1974, the vice president typically resided in his own home, conducting business from his offices in the West Wing and the Eisenhower Executive Office Building next door to the West Wing on the White House premises. When providing security for the vice president's homes became cost prohibitive, Congress authorized a sanctioned home for the vice president. Located on the U.S. Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C., Number 1 Observatory Circle was originally built in 1893 for the superintendent of the observatory. In 1923, the chief of naval operations took a liking to the house and moved into it for himself. Each subsequent CNO called the residence home until Congress approved a resolution to renovate the house into the official residence of the vice president in 1974. The renovations were complete that year, but it would be 3 years before a vice president lived in the house full-time. Nixon's resignation saw Gerald Ford ascending to the White House before he could use the vice presidential residence, and Ford's vice president, Nelson Rockefeller, also owned a well-secured residence in Washington, using Number 1 Observatory Circle only for entertaining. Still, the Rockefellers donated millions of dollars in furnishings to the Queen Anne-style house. Every vice president since Walter Mondale, Jimmy Carter's VP, has lived in the house, each successive vice presidential family decorating the house to suit their own tastes. When Al Gore and his family moved in 1993, his family oversaw a complete redecoration of the house, including a new dining room table, new furniture in the library, and renovation of the grounds and veranda to make them more suited to outdoor entertaining. Lieutenant George C. Ashman of the Union Light Guard once had a chance encounter with President Abraham Lincoln at what became known as Lincoln's Summer White House. The nation was embroiled in civil war, and one night the lieutenant happened upon the president on a midnight stroll, while Lincoln was consumed with thought.
I saw a man walking alone and leisurely across the path I was taking, and as I came near him, I saw it was Mr. Lincoln. At an earlier hour, I would have kept from speaking, but, prompted by anxiety, I said, "Mr. President, isn't it rather risky to be out here at this hour?" He answered, "Oh, I guess not. I couldn't rest, and I thought I'd take a walk." He was quite a distance outside the line of infantry guards about the house where the family was staying. He turned back after I spoke to him, and I passed on to where the escort was camped.
Even at what was ostensibly the first family's escape from the heat and political pressures of downtown Washington, D.C., President Abraham Lincoln's cottage at the Soldiers' Home in the northeastern section of the district often saw the president ruminating on the various problems that he and the divided country faced. From June through November each year of Lincoln's presidency, the first family called the cottage home. Situated on the third highest elevation point in Washington, near what are now the Petworth and Park View neighborhoods, the cottage also served President Buchanan prior to Lincoln's term in office, and served as the summer White House for subsequent presidents Rutherford B. Hayes and Chester A. Arthur as well. During Lincoln's first summer at the Soldiers' Home, he sketched the preliminary draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. In 1935, the Works Progress Administration, the largest and most ambitious of all the New Deal agencies, went to work providing employment for millions of unemployed Americans. At the time, America was suffering from the Great Depression, and President Franklin Roosevelt wanted to use the untapped labor resource to build public buildings and roads. Nearly every community in the United States had a new school, bridge, or park built by the WPA. And in 1938, in Catoctin Mountain Park, near the town of Thurmont, Maryland, an installation known as High Catoctin was opened. The camp was originally designed as a retreat for federal government agents and their families, but 4 years later, President Roosevelt had the property converted into a presidential retreat. Officially designated as Naval Support Facility Thurmont and staffed by the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps, Roosevelt nicknamed the retreat Shangri-La after the fictional Himalayan paradise, and President Dwight D. Eisenhower later officially renamed the installation after his father and grandson, Camp David. In addition to serving as a vacation home or weekend getaway for the first family, Camp David has also hosted foreign dignitaries, as well as a meeting place for cabinet and other advisors to the president. Roosevelt hosted Sir Winston Churchill in 1943, and Eisenhower held his first cabinet meeting at the compound. The Kennedys enjoyed horseback riding, and later President Gerald Ford would ride his snowmobile around the retreat. In 1991, President George H.W. Bush dedicated Evergreen Chapel, a non-denominational church that holds both Catholic Mass and Protestant services, open to, of course, the first family, as well as the 400 military personnel and their families that serve at Camp David. Both Presidents George W. Bush and President Barack Obama made the Evergreen Chapel their primary place of worship, and Bush's youngest sister, Dorothy Bush Koch, was married in the first wedding ceremony ever held at Camp David in June 1992. Most recently, Camp David has hosted the 2012 G8 Summit, where world leaders from the wealthiest industrialized countries met to discuss mainly the European sovereign debt crisis. On President Harry S. Truman's fifth trip to Key West, Florida, to stay at what became known as Truman's Little White House, Truman had just finished an arduous campaign for re-election, and on November 7, 1948, when he arrived at the Naval Airfield in Boca Chica, Florida, the mayor and other prominent citizens of Key West greeted the president. A large banner congratulated the newly elected Truman. President Truman later thanked the mayor and the town of Key West in a letter dated November 13, 1948.
My dear Mayor Adams, please accept from a grateful heart this assurance of my appreciation of the wonderful welcome accorded to me by yourself and the good people of Key West and community. It warmed my heart and will long be treasured among happy Key West memories. May I also express to you, and through you to the citizens of Key West, my hearty appreciation of such a fine message of congratulations. I read your thoughtful expressions and wanted all of you to know how much they mean to me. Very sincerely, yours, Harry S. Truman.
2 years before this visit, Truman was ordered by his doctor to take a vacation in a warm climate. He had just served 19 months in office without a decent break and was diagnosed with exhaustion. The house in Key West offered the perfect prescription. Upon leaving from his first stay in 1946, Truman vowed to return for every vacation. And return he did, staying for 175 days of his presidency, with advances in telephone technology allowing Truman to conduct presidential business from the Key West vacation home. Truman often traveled with members of his cabinet, chiefs of staff, and foreign officials, and they would regularly fish, hold poker games, and show movies at the house. Not long after Truman's re-election, Division Street in Key West was renamed Truman Avenue in honor of the president. Today, the house is an historic site and museum, but the Little White House is still used by presidents, former presidents, and chiefs of staff. Most recently, former President Bill Clinton and Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton spent a weekend at the house in January 2005.
Here's the answer which I will give to President Roosevelt. Put your confidence in us. We shall not fail or falter. We shall not weaken or tire. Neither the sudden shock of battle or the long-drawn trials of vigilance and exertion will wear us down. Give us the tools, and we will finish the job.
During the Second World War, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was a frequent visitor to the White House in Washington, D.C., and a guest of the Roosevelts. Typically, the president's guests stayed one night in the White House, with the rest of the stay to follow in a hotel or embassy. Churchill's ubiquitous presence, however, illustrated the need for an official guest house of the president. Winston Churchill found Roosevelt a stimulating conversationalist and soon called the man a great friend.
Meeting Roosevelt was like uncorking your first bottle of champagne.
One story has it that Churchill, having spent the day and most of the night engaged with Roosevelt in conversation, made his way towards the Roosevelt's family quarters at nearly 3 in the morning. The president was asleep by that time, but Churchill wished to wake President Roosevelt for further discussion. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt encountered Churchill before he could make his way to Franklin, and vehemently persuaded the Prime Minister to wait until breakfast. Not long after this incident, the president approved the purchase of the Blair House for use as the official guest house of the president. The house was originally owned by Dr. Joseph Lovell, first Surgeon General of the United States Army, and was later named for the editor of the Washington Globe and Congressional Globe, the first published record of congressional proceedings, Francis Preston Blair. Blair became a trusted advisor to Presidents Jackson, Lincoln, and Van Buren, and in 1859 he built a home next door to the Blair House for his daughter Elizabeth and her husband, Admiral Samuel Phillips Lee. The Lee House later became a part of the Blair House complex. The purchase by Roosevelt in 1942 included all the china and furnishings in the house, and the Lee House was added to the complex as additional space for foreign dignitaries. In addition to night owl guests like Churchill keeping the president awake, Washington, D.C. hotels were constantly overbooked, and more rooms were needed as World War II continued. After the war, and during the presidency of Harry Truman, it became clear that the White House was in serious need of restoration. Chandeliers swayed and floors wobbled dangerously. By summer of 1948, the living quarters and state dining room had been fitted with emergency supports, but the writing was on the crumbling wall. The house would need to be completely gutted and rebuilt. During the restoration, Truman and the First Family moved into the Blair House. Truman conducted business as usual in the west and east wings of the White House, as those sections remained open during the reconstruction of the main White House. The president commuted each day to the offices. Like his little White House in Key West, Truman began to understand that the White House was simply wherever the president happened to be. Now, especially with improved communication technologies.
It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures.
While living in the Blair House, Truman developed what came to be known as the Truman Doctrine, the policy of communist containment for which Truman asked Congress in 1947 for $400 million for military and economic aid for countries like Greece and Turkey, which were faced with conquest by communist insurrection. Truman also signed the European Recovery Program, or the Marshall Plan, the following year, which was designed to help rebuild European nations wrecked after World War II. An attempt on Truman's life was made while he lived at the Blair House. On November 1st, 1950, Oscar Collazo and Griselio Torresola, two Puerto Rican nationalists, attempted to assassinate the president. Their goal was to bring attention to the independence movement in their home country. They tried to shoot their way into the main entrance of the Blair House, but White House police officers and Secret Service agents returned fire, killing Torresola and wounding Collazo. Truman was awakened by the gunfire and rushed to a window to observe, but was told by a guard to take cover. Today, the Blair House continues to serve guests of the president. In 1953, President Dwight D. Eisenhower was being transported in Air Force Flight 8610 when the aircraft entered the space of Eastern Airlines Commercial Flight 8610. The incident only resulted in minor confusion among a few air traffic controllers, but brought to light the need for any presidential aircraft to have its own unique call sign. A number of aircraft carried the president before Air Force One's official designation. Franklin D. Roosevelt was the first president to travel by air while in office, aboard the modified Douglas Dolphin amphibian plane and the Dixie Clipper, a Boeing 314 flying boat on the way to the 1943 Casablanca Conference in Morocco, a flight that covered 5,500 miles. A later plane, the C-54 Skymaster, dubbed the Sacred Cow, transported Roosevelt, and after his death, President Truman as well. President Truman flew on both the Sacred Cow and Truman's own modified presidential aircraft, a C-118 Liftmaster, which Truman named after his hometown of Independence, Missouri. In 1959, the first official flight of Air Force One took place. The designation is simply that, a designation. It refers to any aircraft carrying the President of the United States. Currently, 2 Boeing VC-25As specifically configured and 2 highly customized Boeing 747-200B series aircraft serve as Air Force One. The double-wide jetliners are equipped with sleeping quarters, conference rooms, and both secure and unsecured telephone and telecommunication lines, should the president have to conduct any business while in the air or during a national emergency. A Boeing C-32 or a Boeing C-40 Clipper modified 757s and 737s respectively serve as Air Force Two for transport of the Vice President when the President is not on board, although Air Force Two will sometimes serve the President of the United States as well. Any marine aviation aircraft carrying the President of the United States, usually a helicopter operated by the HMX-1 Nighthawk Squadron, goes by the call sign Marine One. Initially, responsibility for helicopter transportation of the President and Vice President was shared with the Army, but the Marines took sole responsibility in 1976. Often, Marine One will take off and land on the south lawn of the White House when either Air Force One or a motorcade is not an option for travel. Marine One will also be used to connect with Air Force One on longer journeys. The helicopter today most often used would be the VH-3D Sea King or the VH-60N White Hawk. The first helicopter used for this purpose was the Sikorsky UH-34 Seahorse helicopter in 1957 to transport President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Marine One helicopters will always travel in packs of 5 identical helicopters, and the Marines operating the aircraft, rather than the standard utility uniform, will wear the dress blue Charlie or Delta. While President William McKinley was the first sitting president to ride in an automobile, the first government-owned car was used by Theodore Roosevelt. That car was a Stanley steamer, an automobile powered by a steam engine. President Taft, Roosevelt's successor, selected a steam-powered White Motor Company Model M as his official vehicle, and also approved the purchase of 2 Pierce Arrows, 4-cylinder combustion engine cars for other official state functions. Taft's faith in the automobile saw that the White House stables were converted into auto garages. Franklin D. Roosevelt had the honor of riding in the first car specifically built for use by the president. The Sunshine Special, as it was called, was a 1939 Lincoln V12 convertible equipped with a siren, two-way radio, running lights, and extra-wide running boards and handles for Secret Service agents. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Secret Service heads sought a more secure car for the president and found it in a most unlikely and unsavory place. On December 8, 1941, as Roosevelt rode to the Capitol building to deliver his landmark "Day That Will Live in Infamy" speech, he did so in a heavily armored 1928 Cadillac 341A town sedan, recently confiscated by the Treasury Department from none other than notorious gangster Al Capone. Roosevelt continued to use the former mob car until his own Sunshine Special could be modified with armor plating, bulletproof tires, and storage compartments for submachine guns. A 1961 Lincoln Continental, retrofitted with armor plating, a permanent sedan roof, a new interior, an improved air conditioning system, electronic communications equipment, and bulletproof glass, carried John F. Kennedy through Dealey Plaza on November 22, 1963, the day President Kennedy was assassinated. The limo, like the Lincoln Cosmopolitan limousines used by Truman and Eisenhower, was equipped with a non-bulletproof bubble top in case of inclement weather. In 1981, Ronald Reagan was giving an address to AFL-CIO representatives at the Washington Hilton Hotel. As he left the hotel, John Hinckley Jr. fired on the president. All of Hinckley's bullets failed to hit Reagan, either from misses or the valiant action of Secret Service agent Timothy McCarthy, who took a bullet in the abdomen for the president. However, one of the shots ricocheted off the armor plating of the Lincoln Continental limousine and struck Reagan in the ribs. Reagan survived thanks to the quick actions of the Secret Service and others present, and recovered at the George Washington University Hospital. As of 2013, the current model of presidential limousine is the first not to carry a specific model number. The Secret Service has dubbed the car, based by manufacturer General Motors on the Cadillac DTS, the Beast. While many of the car's specifics are classified, the vehicle boasts a special night vision system, run-flat tires, and offers sealed protection from biochemical attacks. The passenger compartment seats 7, and desks and communications equipment are stored throughout the car so that business may be conducted as the presidential motorcade moves. The Beast is airlifted to foreign countries for the president's use while abroad, and while American and presidential standard flags fly on the car on domestic trips, the standard flag is replaced by that of the country that is currently hosting the United States president as he visits that country.
The increase of crime among us as this country has grown in age has involved the necessity of instituting new and of enlarging the province of our older police systems, with a view to protecting society from the sinister or malicious designs of the unprincipled and reckless, who grow with the growth and strengthen with the strength of all nations. The prime object of this division is to prevent the commission of crime, to hunt out its perpetrators, and to bring to justice discovered offenders against wholesome law. To carry out this laudable purpose more effectually than had eventuated under the old system of local or state police organizations, it was a few years since deemed advisable that our national government should inaugurate an elaborate plan of detection similar to that supported advantageously in European countries, as tending to sound public economy and affording the requisite means materially to aid all minor police bodies in restraining crime, and in bringing to light the horde of lawless offenders who are battening upon the community.
It is estimated that by 1865, 1/3 of the currency in circulation was counterfeit. At that time, bills and coins were minted in the various states by various banks, and so United States legal tender lacked organization and uniformity. Under these conditions, it became easy for counterfeit money to proliferate. Consulting with Secretary of the Treasury Hugh McCulloch, President Abraham Lincoln commissioned the Secret Service on April 14, 1865. The legislation was signed, and on Lincoln's desk the night of the 14th, when he was assassinated. Tasked with the investigation of the assassination and the manhunt of John Wilkes Booth would be the future first director of the Secret Service Division, Colonel William P. Wood. 9 days after Lincoln was assassinated, the investigator, the former superintendent of the old Capitol Prison in Washington, D.C., filed a report from the trail of the president's assassin.
April 23, 1865. Have been out to the residence of Dr. Mudd accompanied by Colonel Wells. The Colonel, A. Allen, Dr. Mudd, and myself have made a personal examination of the premises and matters relating to the murderers. We trace both their horses and know they left Dr. Mudd's house on horseback. About dusk, they were lost. Harold dismounted and went up the road to inquire for directions, and there is no doubt they have left for the Potomac via Port Tobacco and going by way of Matthias Point in Virginia. Dr. Mudd's statement I now believe to be true. The assassins changed horses. Harold was riding the bay mare obtained from Pumphrey's stable, and it may be possible that she fell or threw off Booth and broke his leg. However, I believe, as I have written this morning, I will start for Port Tobacco this evening. My men Kirby and Allen slept last night in the bed used by Booth when his leg was bandaged. All the tales about Booth being in Washington, Pennsylvania, or Upper Maryland are a hoax. We are on his tracks. Rely on it. We are all well. Hoping for success, I remain respectfully your observant servant, Colonel William P. Wood.
3 days later, Wood and the Union soldiers on Booth's trail tracked the assassin to a farm in Port Royal, Virginia, where Booth refused surrender and was shot while trying to escape a burning barn. In July of that year, Colonel Wood was sworn in as the director of the Secret Service. Since one of their initial goals was the elimination of counterfeiters, the service was dedicated to mostly that task. In the 4 years that Wood served as director, the Secret Service arrested more than 200 counterfeiters. It would take another 36 years and the assassination of 2 more presidents, James A. Garfield in 1881 and William McKinley in 1901, before the Congress added protection of the president to the list of duties performed by the Secret Service. Since 1901, every president from Theodore Roosevelt on has been protected by the Secret Service. In 1917, threats against the president became a felony, and Secret Service protection was broadened to include all members of the First Family. In 1951, protection of the Vice President and the President-elect was added. After the assassination of presidential candidate Robert Kennedy in 1968, President Lyndon B. Johnson authorized the Secret Service to protect all presidential candidates. Today's Secret Service is made up of 2 primary divisions, the Uniform Division and the Special Agent Division. The primary role of the Uniform Division is protection of the White House and its immediate surroundings, as well as the residence of the Vice President and over 170 foreign embassies located in Washington, D.C. Originally named the White House Police, the Uniform Division was established by an act of Congress on July 1, 1922, during President Warren G. Harding's administration. The Special Agent Division is charged with 2 missions: protection and investigation. During the course of their careers, special agents carry out assignments in both of these areas. Their many investigative responsibilities include counterfeiting, forgery, and financial crimes. In addition to protecting the president, the vice president, and their immediate families, agents also provide protection for foreign heads of state and heads of government who are visiting the United States. Throughout the Secret Service's history, the division answered to the Treasury Department until 2003, when the Secret Service came under the governance of the Department of Homeland Security. In March of 2013, President Barack Obama named the first female director of the Secret Service, a former police officer and the highest-ranking woman in the service at the time of her ascension to director. Julia Pearson has served in the male-dominated Secret Service since 1984, and in addition to serving as Chief of Staff and Assistant Director of the Office of Human Resources and Training in the agency, she also served on presidential protective details for the George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush administrations.
And leading the world to space helped America achieve new heights of prosperity here on Earth, while demonstrating the power of a free and open society to harness the ingenuity of its people. And in fulfilling this task, we will not only extend humanity's reach in space, we will strengthen America's leadership here on Earth.
In over 200 years, the United States of America has seen its executive branch of government under the control of but 44 men. These men saw the country through times of war and peace, through times of reconstruction and stability, and through times of hardship and prosperity. Each man who has taken the presidential oath has had a plethora of difficult responsibilities before him. Often a divisive political figure, the president must pass or veto United States laws, nominate federal judges, like those who serve on the Supreme Court, and act as Commander-in-Chief of the United States Armed Forces. Who were these great men? How has their leadership shaped the country, government, and way of life we now know today? And what does the future hold for the office of the President of the United States of America? Each new American president changes the office in ways unforeseen by previous generations. Technology and social attitudes work together to shape each new administration and make the monumental burdens of being president just a little bit easier to manage. The institutions and implements used by each administration to protect and restore the American way of life and government are as unique to each president as a fingerprint. As the office evolves, from what new additions to the executive branch of the American government will future presidents benefit? One message is clear. The presidents must continue to work tirelessly to protect the Constitution, the country, and all the people they serve. And all the accoutrements in place to aid the administration are nothing without a strong leader in place. From George Washington to Barack Obama, from horse-drawn carriage to the automobile, the American capitals in New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C., and even the Little White House in Key West. This has been our all-encompassing look at the president, from politics to power.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.